For more on military relations between the United States and China, I'm joined now by Sourabh Gupta. He's a senior fellow at the Institute for China-America Studies. Well, you watch this relationship quite closely. What do you make of this meeting?
Oh, I think it's a great sign. And I think some credit is due to Defense Secretary Mattis, too. You know, in the last 2 years of the Obama administration, his defense secretary, Ash Carter, never showed up in Beijing and didn't have meetings with the leading Chinese defense minister or his counterpart. Once President Trump did come in, they set the diplomatic and security dialogue framework. They had a meeting last year. Yes, this year it's been postponed, canceled, et cetera, et cetera. But it's good that Secretary Mattis is willing to engage his counterpart, especially because there are pressing issues involved here.
Yeah, you make some really good points here. It's interesting, you know, they canceled the participation of the Chinese in RIMPAC, and of course, a lot made out of the cancellation of this meeting. Now, of course, they're meeting. Mattis says he's seeking to forge more resilient military ties that can withstand mounting pressure between the world's two largest economies, in essence, kind of alluding to the fact that this tariff war is underway. How does that look, more resilient relationship between these two militaries, do you think?
A more resilient relationship will come through more communication between the two parties, and more communication will come through institutionalized exchanges. In 2017, there were actually quite a lot of institutionalized exchanges beneath the defense secretary level. And so I think it was on a good track. This year, things have not gone as well as they could have. You know, the year started with the US releasing a national security strategy report, which effectively called China a revisionist power out to overturn the system. There hasn't been any policies as such from the US Department which would further that viewpoint of its with regard to China. So at this point of time, I think there's an ample space for engagement, and the two sides are engaging each other. But there is this sense that, are we seeing a new Cold War breakout here? Are we not? And so those fears are always kind of shadowing these discussions. And
it seems as though we kind of focus in laser-like on certain issues. I mean, these B-52s flying over, that of course can enhance tensions in this relationship. These two meeting, are we magnifying all of this too much, do you think?
No, I wouldn't say we are magnifying too much. You know, for the United States particularly, after the land reclamations were made and the artificial islands built in the South China Sea, there has been this thought that there has been a complete change in the status quo. A change in the status quo to the fact that its navigational interests in the South China Sea have been impeded, but more importantly, that those artificial islands could be jumping off points for China's power projection in the Western Pacific. And the US ideally doesn't want to tolerate competition, maritime competition in the Western Pacific. Now for China, the land reclamations was not the inflection point. The arbitration with the Philippines was the inflection point. Once that ended, China-Southeast Asia relations have improved considerably. So the US and China see things a little differently, and the South China Sea, yes, is part of this topic, which complicates and makes matters that much more.
And we're seeing, you pointed it out the other day, again, we had a story about it, the closer relationship between China and the Philippines. This meeting, obviously very important. Next month, President Trump and President Xi sit down and meet. Are we going to see a thawing, do you think?
The thawing, if it does happen, will need to be on the trade front. I think, again, let's put this in perspective. The two countries have jostled and competed from a defense and military perspective in some respects for over 20, 25 years. But on the economic and trade front, we are essentially seeing the lowest point since the normalization of ties in the late 1970s. And therefore, the emphasis needs to be on trying to right that ship and get that trade and economic investment relationship working. I am encouraged by the fact that just yesterday, Treasury Secretary put out a fairly moderate report on China's currency practices. It could have gone a lot far, and considering how President Trump has moved without evidence to penalize China, it could have done so even on the currency front, but it did not. But it's important that President Xi and President Trump get some sort of positive momentum moving on the trade and economic dialogue.
Well, we'll be watching for that. Sourabh Gupta, always a pleasure. Thanks for coming in.